So I'll be the first to admit that our conversations about Pitt football haven't always been sunshine and rainbows this offseason. It hasn't always been bright and shiny and happy. And certainly it's been a bit of a bummer at times. And I think in the last 3-2-1 column I wrote, which was not last Friday but the Friday before, a lot of it was kind of down in the dumps about this coming season, about the trends of Pitt football, maybe the trajectory that the program is on. And even like up to yesterday when we wrote about, when we talked on the Morning Pitt about how there's no buzz for football recruiting, or why isn't there any buzz for football recruiting? And that was partially about Pitt football recruiting, but it was about football recruiting overall, maybe the overall state of the enterprise, so to speak. The gist, though, was the same. That it was just that, boy, things just don't seem all that happy and excited, And, I was talking to a friend the other day who was, a Pitt fan, and he was like, I'm a lot more excited for basketball than I am for football. And I can't remember the last time it was this, there was this much disparity. And I think there's some truth that I think there is more excitement for basketball than football right now, partially because basketball is coming off back-to-back 20-win seasons. Basketball, seems, I think Jeff Cable had a pretty good offseason with who he added from the high school and the portal ranks. Football obviously coming off their worst season in 20 years, 25 years. And so, yeah, there's going to be a contrast there. There's going to be a bit of a disparity in the hype and the excitement. But I don't know if it has to be necessarily quite as bad as it's been, or quite as down in the dumps as it's been lately. And so I thought we could maybe talk about it a little bit today. A few things that you should be excited about with Pitt football. A few reasons to feel optimistic about Pitt football. A few reasons to look at 2024 as a season where Pitt football can bounce back from last year and maybe take a step forward and start laying the path toward a better tomorrow and a better future. So let's do that today. I'm guessing this video won't get as many hits as the ones that are bummers, but, what are you going to do? Let's talk about some good things about Pitt football, some reasons to be optimistic about the Panthers for 2024 here on the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. All right, it's Wednesday. It's the Morning Pitt. It's youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com here for a little Pitt conversation, and glad you could tune in this morning. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all those things that we always ask you to do. And I hope you like this episode, because I hope you like at least some of the things. I can't say I doubt that I'm going to say anything you're going to be like, I hadn't thought about that before. But I think there are a few. Look, everybody's down after a 3-9 season. I get that. And I think some of the reasons why there was a 3-9 season, I think some of that, some of the offseason acquisitions, maybe you weren't as bowled over by those as you hoped to be. And so I get why maybe, the reaction is what it is, or the expectations are what they are. But at the same time, I think there are some things to look forward to with this team. I think there are some reasons to think this team can make a real step forward in 2024 from where it was a year ago. And I think, inevitably when we talk about this team and what they're going to be this season, a lot of the conversation is going to be about like comparisons to last year. I think we went through this either on a Morning Pitt, or Jim and I did it on the live show on one of these Wednesday night live streams. And, where we kind of compare like position by position. Which position is going to be better this year? Which position's not, going to be about the same? Which position is going to be worse? Where did they take a step forward? Where did they take a step back? And we went kind of position by position, just to try and get a sense of, should 2024 be better than 2023? And so we always sort of make these comparisons. And I think we can start this conversation today right there. If we think about last year versus this year, or this year versus last year. And one thing that, and we'll go more into detail on this in a minute, but one thing I think you have to start with, like I think it's important just to say right off the bat, and I don't think you can have a conversation about last season on its own or last season versus this season without starting here. It's the fact that they just did not give themselves a chance in the first 5 games of the season due to the quarterback situation. And that's a simple reality of it. And maybe you don't say the first 5, maybe not the Wofford game, but 4 games, after the Wofford game, until they benched Phil Dracovic, they did not give themselves a chance. 1/3 of the schedule, they had a very slim chance of winning because of the situation at quarterback. You could look at most games and say, look, there's no like guaranteed wins, guaranteed losses, because we've seen guaranteed losses turns into wins, and we've seen guaranteed wins turn into losses. But I think you could look at most games on the schedule and say they're either, likely to win, likely to lose, or a toss-up, right? I mean, loosely. Like you look at the Florida State or Notre Dame games last year, I think you'd say those were likely losses. Certainly a bunch of games you could look at last year and say should have been likely wins. I think with the quarterback decisions that they made for the first 5 games of the season, particularly those 4 games after the Wofford game, they moved those games independent of anything talent to talent, team to team. They moved those games into the likely loss category with the decision to go with Phil Dracovic. And you can have a whole separate side conversation about, well, what does that say about the coaching staff? What does that say about Pat Narduzzi? What does that, that doesn't exactly inspire confidence for this year. And I understand that, and there's a separate conversation to be had about that. Although the guy who was ultimately making that decision has been fired, but I understand if you want to say that's great, but the head coach still should have stepped in at some point, and you'd be right to say so. But I don't think you can have a conversation about last year versus this year without just starting there and saying that they just did not give themselves a chance. They put themselves so far behind the 8 ball that all the other issues they may have had, other talent issues, whether it was the pass rush or the O-line or whatever it may be, outside linebacker play at times, all of those issues were amplified because the play at quarterback was a complete liability. Complete liability. I mean, you remember when we talked about the North Carolina game. I mean, Phil seemed to be doing pretty well there. He kind of bounced back and he was playing well before he got hurt and missed the second half. I mean, in that half he was 11 of 15, so that's nice for 109 yards, and no touchdowns. So he averaged I guess 7 yards per completion. 11 of 15 for 109. He was just sort of checking the ball. Now, it wasn't anything special. He didn't throw any touchdown passes, and they still went into halftime down 28-17. And some of that's on the defense for giving up the 4 scores. But irregardless, no, he wasn't good, and he wasn't good enough to win, and he wasn't going to help them win. They weren't going to be able to win with him at quarterback. And so you start right there and say, right off the bat, and we'll talk about Nate Yarnell specifically in a second, but right off the bat, just not having that situation is a step forward. I think you can also look at the schedule. All right, I think when you would compare 2023 to 2024, the schedule is far more favorable. If for nothing else, you replace Notre Dame with Kent State. That's an upgrade. Right? I don't know if Cincinnati's going to be better or worse than they were a year ago. I don't know if West Virginia's going to be better or worse than they were a year ago. There's Youngstown State. That's your Wofford game. But instead of Notre Dame, they have Kent State. We talked about this. Probably last week. Right? We talked about when we talked about the over-unders, of taking the over-under 5.5. Here's something else I would say about the schedule. And yeah, they're going to have Clemson and they're going to have Louisville, and they're going to have some challenging games on there. Who knows what Syracuse is going to be. But when you look at the ACC, they miss most of the top quarterbacks, at the very least, and what I think are probably some of the top teams. They're not going to face Miami with Cam Ward, who's expected to be one of the best quarterbacks in the conference. They're not going to face NC State and Grayson McCall, again, another top transfer who came in. Florida State and DJ Uiagalelei, who came in as a transfer. And I think I might have gotten that right. They're not going to see Haynes King at Georgia Tech, who I think has a chance to be one of the best quarterbacks in the conference this year. Even Kyron Drones at Virginia Tech gave them trouble last year. They don't see him this year. I would say those are probably 5, maybe your top 5 quarterbacks in the conference, 5 of the top 7 at worst. You guys see these balloons? Why are there balloons on the screen? I wasn't sure if you were actually seeing them, but then I rewatched the video, I think it was from Monday, and saw that actually happened then too. I don't know why those balloons appear. If you're listening to the audio podcast, you're like, what is he talking about balloons? But if you're watching the video, which I always ask you to do because that actually helps us, I don't know why those balloons appear. I don't know what I say. I don't know what happens. I don't know if it's something with my computer or the recording software or whatever it is. So I don't know why those balloons appeared. Maybe those balloons appeared because Pitt doesn't have to face Grayson McCall or DJU or Cam Ward. Woohoo! Party, party! And if it's your birthday, those balloons are for your birthday. Happy birthday. So they miss those guys. Some of the best quarterbacks in the conference, they're not going to have to face those guys. That's an advantage. I mean, good quarterbacks always beat this defense. You know, it's very rare that Pitt has held a good quarterback in check. That's just sort of part of it. Good quarterbacks can beat this defense. They miss the best quarterbacks in the conference. They're not going to have to face those guys. I think that's a big. Even if you want to say, all right, Louisville, Clemson, Carolina, is always going to be a challenge. I don't know what their quarterback situation is going to be like, but the game's in Chapel Hill, so that's always going to be tough. But they miss those guys, and they miss those best quarterbacks, and I think that's huge. I think that helps a lot with this schedule. Now, as for Pitt's quarterback, I was digging around, looking at some stats, moving numbers around, and that kind of thing on Pro Football Focus, trying to see what we could find out where Nate Yarnell really kind of stacks up in the ACC. And, obviously he had limited opportunities last year. 70 dropbacks according to Pro Football Focus. And so I scaled it to that. Quarterbacks in the ACC with a minimum of 70 dropbacks. And there are actually 22 of them. Out of those 22 quarterbacks who had 70 dropbacks in the ACC last year, Nate Yarnell was number 1 in yards per attempt with 9.4. He was number 2 in completion percentage at 65.1%. If you look at Pro Football Focus, they have the big time throw stat. It's a pass. I'm reading from Pro Football Focus's site here. A pass with excellent ball location and timing, generally thrown further down the field or into a tighter window. Big time throws. Nate Yarnell had a big time throw percentage, like the percentage of his throws that were big time throws, ranked 3rd in the conference. For context, Drake May was better by about 1.5 percentage points. 7.7% of Drake May's passes last year were big-time throws, according to Pro Football Focus. That was number 1 in the conference, 7.7%. Nate Yarnell was 6.2% on the big-time throws. His average depth of target was 2nd in the ACC last year among quarterbacks with at least 70 dropbacks. His adjusted completion percentage, which is a stat that Pro Football Focus puts together, percentage of aimed passes thrown on target. It's completions plus the drops divided by the number of aimed passes. So no throwaways or spikes or things like that. He was 6th in the conference in adjusted completion percentage. Nate Yarnell, an NFL passer rating among ACC quarterbacks who had at least 70 dropbacks last year. You know who was number 1? Wasn't Jordan Travis. He was number 2. Wasn't Drake May. He was number 3. Kyron Drones, number 4. Garrett Schrader, number 5. On and on and on. All these guys. You know who was number 1 in the ACC in NFL passer rating among quarterbacks with at least 70 dropbacks? It's your boy, the big Y. This is the Y, right? Nate Yarnell. Yarny. Number 1. So, I keep sort of pulling my punches with Nate Yarnell, saying he just needs to be average. If he's just average, he's going to be good. I think he can be better than average. And I think his performance, admittedly in a small sample size last season, was better than average. In fact, compared to other quarterbacks with, at least as many snaps and dropbacks as he had, it was among the best in the conference. Small sample size, but, and you might say, oh, big deal, man. He's playing against Boston College and Duke, and that's great. But who's on their schedule? You're right. That wasn't against Florida State. It was against Notre Dame, at least for a few passes. But who's on their schedule this year? Not every game is Notre Dame and Florida State this year. They have West Virginia. They have Cincinnati. They have Boston College, right? Who else do they play? Virginia. Syracuse. Like when you're thinking about the over-under on the win totals, look at the caliber of teams they're facing. Again, it comes back to the schedule being far more manageable this year than it was a year ago. And so, sure, Yarnell only did that against Boston College and Duke, but that's the level of probably 8, 9 of the maybe 10 of the teams they're facing this season. So play at that level. Play at that level where you're among the best in the ACC, and guess what might happen? You might win a few games. Now, of course, quarterback play is going to have a lot to do with blocking. I'm not going to sit here on this podcast and say there aren't questions about this team. And one of the big questions is the depth of the offensive line. But I think when you look across the starting five they can put out there, with Branson Taylor and Ryan Barrett tackle, with Terrence Moore at center, with B.J. Williams at guard, with either Lyndon Cooper or Ryan Jacoby at guard, I think you can get a solid starting five. You're going to have depth issues. If you have to go into the depth, if they have to, bring somebody out because of injury or something like that, then yeah, it could get a little dicey. And that's certainly been the case over the past few years. They've had O-line injuries, which has led to dicey situations. Starting five, I think, will be good enough to keep Nate Yarnell upright. Oh, he had one other stat that I thought was great. Where is this? This is one other Yarnell stat. The percentage of pressures turned into sacks. So what percentage of pressures end up as sacks? Nate Yarnell was 7th in the ACC. The 7th lowest percentage of pressures that turned into sacks. So he didn't get pressured a ton. When he did, he managed to avoid most of them turning into sacks. I think it was only 14% of pressures turned into sacks last year for Nate Yarnell. So again, I think the O-line should do a decent job protecting him if that starting five can stay healthy. And then, Yarnell has shown that even if there's some pressure, he can stay alive out there, keep a play alive, and make a play. So I think that's something to like about him. You're going to need the O-line to stay healthy. And look, I'm not going to sit here and go through every position group on offense and say, I don't have any questions about it. And I'm not going to do that on defense either. I do have questions about the depth on the offensive line. I do have questions about the wide receivers. I'm still not sure there's that, alpha number one guy out there. Maybe Kenny Johnson emerges as that. Maybe Konate Mumfield takes a big step forward. Maybe one of these guys from Western Carolina can pull it off. But I'm not going to say that guy, I still have questions about that. But I don't have questions about Gavin Bartholomew. And by God, somebody's got to figure it out how to get the ball to him. If Cade Bell does nothing other than get the ball to Gavin Bartholomew this year, I'll say he has done a good job. He's a playmaker. And he can make plays. He can take advantage of soft spots in the defense, and he can turn it into something. And so that's another thing to feel good about. Nate Yarnell, okay, with small sample size, but some of the best numbers in the conference. Gavin Bartholomew, a really solid starting five on the O-line. And at least guys who's at receiver are reliable receivers. We'll see if a game breaker emerges, but did I say game breaker or game maker? A playmaker or a game breaker emerges at wide receiver. But I think with Yarnell, a solid starting five, and Bartholomew, you've got a pretty good foundation for the offense. Defensively, yeah, I still have questions about the defensive line, and those questions aren't going to be answered anytime soon. But I'll say this. I don't really think this defensive line will be all that much less effective than last year's defensive line was. I mean, last year's defensive line did very little to pressure the quarterbacks, and there are probably a lot of reasons for that, ranging from talent to opportunity. But I don't think this year's defensive line is going to do any less. I don't think they're going to pressure any less. I don't think they're going to be any less effective than that year's group was. So at the minimum, you're just carrying over the ineffectiveness, with the potential for one or two guys to kind of break out. And if ever there was a year for guys to break out, this might be it. Moving back through the defense, though, I think you got to like the back seven, or at least the five up the middle. I think these linebackers will be really good. Potentially the best group of linebackers Pat Narduzzi has had, or that we've seen at Pitt over the last 10 years. I think they've got the potential to be that. There's going to be youth and inexperience out there, but it's talented youth. It's talented and experience. I think it's players who can be pretty good as they grow and develop on the field. And I think you'll see guys like Rasheem Biles and Jordan Bass and Braylon Lovelace flash out there, and Kyle Lewis, in addition to Brandon George and Key Thompson. I mean, I think it's going to be a really good group of linebackers, and I think the safeties are really good too. Donovan McMillan's one of the top tackling defenders in the country last year, and I don't see any reason why he'll slow down at all. The only thing that's going to cut into Donovan McMillan's numbers is if guys like Cruz Brookins and Jesse Anderson keep pushing him, and Javon McIntyre and PJ O'Brien. They've got a lot of safeties right now, and so Donovan McMillan might end up with fewer tackles than he had last year, if only because they rotate safeties more because they've got that kind of talent. Look, this team, I don't think they're going to win the ACC, but I'm coming around more and more to the idea of them hitting the over on that 5.5 and pushing into, pushing for like 8 wins. I think there's enough there, and maybe maybe I'm changing my tune from like a week ago, because I think it was last Wednesday that we talked about the over under on 5.5 wins, and I said I really wasn't sure. It's a big risk, really might just barely make it. Well, I'm pushing for it. I'm feeling a little more optimistic. I'm taking a more positive tone this week, and maybe you will as well. Look, we got BJ Williams on the screen right there, shoving a defensive lineman back, saying, "Believe in us, we can get it done." Ryan Bear right behind him as well. So that was timely for those guys to pop up on screen. I'll have to try and remember that photo and use it for our thumbnail here on the video. Listen, let me know what you think. Do you see some positives with this team? Do you see some spots where this team can maybe be a little bit better than the prevailing sentiment has had them this offseason? Even here on this podcast, it's been the prevailing sentiment, but maybe we should lighten up a little bit, give them a little more credit, because maybe they're heading in the right direction in some spots. So we'll see. Let me know what you think, and like this video and subscribe. Don't forget to check out the website Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com for all the Pitt sports coverage. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, check out the website, and do all those things. And don't forget, tonight we will be live for the Panther-Lair show right here at 8 p.m. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Jim Hammett and me hanging out for an hour of Pitt sports talk. So tune in then. We'd love to have a conversation with you about Pitt sports, probably talk about all these things, talk about Amsel Delalich and Pitt basketball and recruiting and everything else going on. So tune in tonight for the Panther-Lair show at 8 o'clock, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Thanks so much for tuning in today. It's been a lot of fun talking to you, and we'll catch up with you tonight for the live show and tomorrow for the Morning Pitt right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.